going?
It's going very well, thank you. How are you?
Good.
I'm a little bit worried though, because I'm conscious that we want to talk about CMC, and from my own experience, CMC really matters, and we need to get a guest that we can really talk to it that will help us understand, some of the experiences in that they've had, and equally the importance of leaders that can help move that forward. But I'm a little bit at a loss with regards to who to recommend. I mean, have you got any thoughts?
Well, actually, I do have a thought. In fact, someone who's actually been a recurring guest on our CMO series of podcasts, and that would be Ed Kaye.
Now you got me interested. Let's go. Welcome to Regulatory, the Emerging C-Suite Leader.
This is a podcast where you will be able to hear real-life stories regarding first-in-human challenges, accelerated programs, and understanding what's important from the investor narrative. If you are a biotech CEO, an investor, or a regulatory executive, this podcast is for you.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm very excited this time to be speaking with Ed Kaye, CEO of Aurora Therapeutics, a preclinical stage company focused on next-generation gene editing to address rare disease. Ed, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about yourself and Aurora Therapeutics?
My background, I started out in academia. I was trained as a pediatric neurologist and biochemical geneticist, and then went to industry after a number of years, and started out in industry at Genzyme, where I ran clinical development for all of the genetic and lysosomal storage diseases for 10 years. And then I moved to Sarepta, where I became CEO, and we had developed the first therapy for Duchenne muscular dystrophy using exon skipping. And I had also went to Stoke, where we had developed really the first genetic approach for epilepsy, and that was to upregulate the missing sodium channel protein. And then in the last several months, I have moved over to Aurora Therapeutics, where we are focusing on trying to develop gene editing really for many rare patients. And so our focus is initially on phenylketonuria, PKU, going after the common mutations, but then developing the system to treat not just the common mutations, but the rare mutations also. So we're trying to develop a system that allows us to go after many inborn errors of metabolism and kind of use the regulatory strategy that the FDA has developed, and also some innovation in CMC to try to have a fit-for-scale manufacturing for rare gene editing patients.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting and very difficult path, obviously, to be manufacturing at scale for a bit small patient population. So when you think about that, how important is it to think about, the product, chemistry, manufacturing, and controls and quality, and when you're developing the target product profile for your asset to take into account, the rare disease, the patient population, patient preference, et cetera?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of most companies, you do your clinical trial and you have, you really don't need a lot of drug product to be able to accommodate patients in the clinical trial. However, once you commercialize, usually the challenge is how to scale up and how do you treat the world with an approved medication. In the rare diseases, it's almost the opposite. What we're trying to do is to try to reduce the cost, because obviously cost can be a major impediment in the rare disease for manufacturing, and trying to figure out how do we manufacture just the right amount of medicine based on the population of patients that we're trying to treat. So one of the ways that we're looking at is there are common elements in gene editing, like the LNP, which is used, the lipid nanoparticles that are used to deliver the product, and the base editor, which are the same over and over again. So all we're changing is the last 20 nucleotides in the guide RNA. And so what we do is we reuse parts of the drug over and over again. We can basically manufacture at large scale, and then only try to get the exact amount of drug that we need for the guide RNA. So it's a bit of a puzzle that we have to put together. And part of it is, in order to make this work, it has to really, the cost of goods has to be reasonable. And so one of our challenges is to make sure that we can really control the manufacturing process and really try to reduce the cost.
I really like the analogy, Ed, of a puzzle. And I mean, I'm interested to understand a little bit more when you think about, phase appropriate CMC strategy. What do you see whether you could say a few words on what you see the role of a regulatory leader in phase appropriate CMC strategy? And I mean, maybe you can share some examples where it's worked well, or where there are examples that regulatory perhaps wasn't at the table, and there may have been a misalignment in expected deliverables, like a potency assay at a key development milestone like an IND.
Yeah, I think and obviously you know this better than I, but the major cause for a complete response letter from the FDA for a new company and a new product is actually a problem with CMC. And I think one of the challenges is that we often don't think enough ahead to consider what are some of the CMC issues. So you can make a product and it could be fit for purpose for a phase one, and oftentimes the challenge is, of course, you have different specificities depending on what you're trying to use the drug for. So typically when we do the toxicology studies, we want, let's say, a little dirtier drug. In other words, have a wider spec so that we have a range that we can deal with for our toxicology. Because the problem is that, as you know, it's not always easy to make the drug exactly the same every time, and there's some variability. So you want to make sure that you have the toxicology to cover the various different specs. But then, I think one of the challenges is that, what people forget, you have to have the potency assays, the release assays. You have to really have control of your manufacturing process. And one of the big challenges, of course, have you documented everything that you've done? And can you demonstrate to the FDA that you have control of manufacturing? And I think that often gets neglected. There's such an emphasis on the clinical trial, showing that it works, showing that it's safe. And then suddenly in retrospect, you say, oh, by the way, we have to be able to demonstrate to the FDA that we can make the drug over and over again exactly the same. And sometimes that process, you don't, and what I see with a lot of companies is you just don't have control of the manufacturing. And there are some variabilities from batch to batch, and that can lead to just major problems and delays in getting the product approved.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. And the complete response letters, being related to CMC and so forth. So kind of pivoting a little bit from, as an emerging biotech, I think you recognize, funds are limited. It's expensive to make these. You mentioned the cost of goods. And getting to proof of concept as quickly as possible is, one of the key inflection points for, continued funding. So you still need to ensure, appropriate manufacturing investments along this pathway. So how do you see the role of regulatory in helping you navigate what is appropriate in terms of development of, say, analytical assays or potency assays, et cetera, that determining whether the GMP material is required for a given study, that sort of thing, in terms of moving the path forward?
So, one of the things I think that we're seeing, and especially in the rare disease, is that there is more flexibility, I would say, on the part of preclinical studies and some of the manufacturing in early studies on the part of the FDA. At least we're seeing that in the FDA. But I think as you go through, and certainly when you start to see data, typically in a phase one, it's mostly for safety, and then your phase two. And in rare disease, we often do a phase one, phase two, because the populations are small. But then the phase two is your proof of concept. But I would say by the time you get into your registrational study, the phase three, you really have to lock down all of the assays, the release assays and the potency assays and everything, and making sure that you have control of the manufacturing. So I think it is a stage system. So you can, let's say you can have an easier path for some of the early stage trials that you're doing. But once you get into that phase three, the one thing that I've always learned is whatever you use in your phase 3, you better understand your manufacturing, because that should be then the product that you're going to commercialize. And by that point, you have to have everything under control and make sure that it's regulatory compliant.
Yeah. Just to follow up a little bit on that, I know that FDA, earlier this year released the flexibility in CMC manufacturing, which really I don't think is that anything brand new, but really just telegraphing to everybody that, hey, there's flexibility built in here. We understand how difficult manufacturing is, and allowing the flexibility in terms of specifications starting big and narrowing it down as you get further along in the development path. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is nothing new. It's been in the guidance for a long time, and the same thing that for a rare disease, you can have one pivotal trial and you don't have to have massive numbers. That's that's certainly been around since the Orphan Drug Act. And so I think sometimes the FDA guidance is kind of a reiteration of what's already been there.
So Ed, you referenced locking down certain steps at certain points in development. I guess the reality is we all recognise that drug development is imperfect. It rarely follows the straight line that you wish it would. And you can go from, ideally wanting to go from step A to step B to step C, but sometimes you go straight from A to C. You miss out B and you miss out the data you would have necessarily generated at step B. So all of that really then puts teams in a position where they need to be comfortable managing downstream CMC risk. So that might be bridging and comparability later in development. Well, you're also trying to work out, will you be able to show in phase 3 that your asset is both safe and effective? So you're trying to manage expectations with the board and investors, management. So are there examples that come to mind where you've been in that situation where you're managing that downstream risk opposite other risks that need to be managed? And what have you sort of looked to from a regulatory leader when you've been in that situation with the teams that you've worked with?
Well, one of the challenges that certainly we had at Genzyme when we were when the focus was primarily on recombinant proteins. And so in recombinant proteins, one of the challenges is that, of course, when you're doing your early studies, you're at a small scale manufacturing. So you're at a certain leader. But then as you ramp up and you get closer to commercialization, you have to get to larger and larger scale production. And then the challenge comes in is when you go from, let's say you go from a 30-liter bioreactor to a 300-liter or a bioreactor, oftentimes the specs change, and then now you have to show that is your drug working the same, and it's I would say it can be very challenging, and you're looking at how comparable are the different products, because sometimes you're using slightly different products from one stage of development to another. Most of the time it's not relevant. It doesn't make that much of a difference either from safety or for efficacy, but you do have to be able to show some of the basically that they're comparable, and I think it means going back. In the instance of Genzyme, we actually had 2 different approved formulations that were based on different sized bioreactors, and that was the only way that we could get around it. We had one for infants and another for old, and then eventually we were able to show comparability to the basically to the 400-liter scale. But it was let's just say it was a challenging time, and I would say from a regulatory perspective, what I found is having discussions often with the FDA from the regulatory person, telling them what you want to do, making sure they're in agreement is probably the best way to avoid mistakes.
Just to build up on that, what you felt was important then was clearly that sort of partnership with the agency and ensuring you had a regulatory voice representing your company in that sort of dialogue with the agency to kind of work your way through, build the trust, the relationship, and help navigate a path forward.
Absolutely, because I think and really in order to be successful, I like the term partnership. It has to be a partnership, and it can't be adversarial, because at the end of the day, you want to make a medicine basically that's going to be the same every time, and make sure that it's safe and effective. And so that's the FDA's goal also. So the question is, there are some times when you get into situations that neither the company nor the FDA have actually experienced it before. So sometimes you have to find your way together to figure out what's the right approach. And as you know, not everything is straightforward in our business. Sometimes there are things we don't completely understand. But I think what's important is to make sure that the FDA, or any agency appreciates that the company has the patient's best interest at heart, in that that what you're trying to do is to solve a problem. You're not trying to get out of certain regulations or get around certain regulations. What you're trying to do is, how do we make sure and come up, and oftentimes it's a compromise to come up with a solution for the right manufacturing pathway.
Yeah. So Ed, you mentioned, about, solving a problem, but, thinking about it in terms of like, how do we avoid problems? And I think about, quality by design is a CMC frequently used buzzword. What does that mean to you in terms of problem avoidance? How have you seen it play out in practice? And what do you see the role of regulatory in ensuring that there is a quality by design approach in your manufacturing process?
I think what we often forget, we always think of the CMC, especially when you get into your final drug product, is the whole process validation, where you have 3 PV runs and you make sure they're comparable. But I think what we're seeing now is manufacturing is a continuous evolution. It just doesn't stop after you make your 3 PV runs. And the question is how do you incorporate kind of changes, I would say, in the manufacturing process, and make sure that you're keeping up and have the best product that's available based on the equipment that you have. So again, I think it's really trying to think ahead, and making sure that you have the best design that gives you basically the cleanest product with the highest specificity, and kind of making sure that you're telegraphing the regulatory agencies ahead of time on some of the process changes that you're doing, because there's always going to be process changes that you run into problems, and the question is how do you solve them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the biggest challenges is, I keep coming back to potency assay, because that does seem to be one of the biggest challenges, and trying to tie whatever potency assay you have to, the clinical efficacy. Have you had challenges in that aspect, and how have you seen regulatory navigate that?
One of the challenges in gene editing that we have is, what you're looking for is the efficiency of editing for a particular mutation. So obviously in gene editing, what you're trying to do is to fix one particular point mutation, and typically what you'll have is a number of different products. In other words, guide RNAs which are targeted for a specific point mutation, and they're not all going to be the same in the same gene. And so one of the challenges is, how do you know what the efficiency of each guide RNA is going to be, and how do you test that? And so typically, and we're actually trying to kind of help develop that now, working with the agency and figuring it out. But what we're looking at is that we would have a range of let's say, editing efficiency, and that you set a lower limit. Obviously, the upper limit would be 100%, but you set a lower limit that is good enough and that you have to achieve. And one of the challenges that has to be done, you can't do it in animals, because for the human genome is very specific. And so if you're trying to correct a point mutation in a gene in a person, data in mice or in NHPs are not helpful. You can't do it. And so you end up having to develop in vitro assays. And so in our case, we're going after hepatic gene editing. So we have hepatocytes that have the mutation in it, and then what we look at is what's the efficiency of editing in cells, because in patients you can't do a liver biopsy and measure the efficiency of gene editing. So you have to depend on basically in vitro gene testing in cell culture. And so that's different from usually what we think. Typically, we have potency. You're going to test, in certainly in animals, but in this particular case, we look for toxicity in the animals for certain components. But if we're looking for efficiency, we can only do it in cells.
Just listening to this conversation that Deborah and I are having with you, it's clear that you have such a wealth of experience, based upon this discussion we're having. I'm intrigued if you were to sort of step back and reflect. What advice would you give to a CEO or a C-suite leader at an early stage company about the importance of early integration of regulatory strategy into CMC, alongside all of the other priorities and pressures that they necessarily need to manage? What would your advice be?
I think what I have found is that for a young company, you never have the CMC experience within the company yourself. And I would say CMC regulatory is a subspecialty in its own right. And it's different than, there's a lot of aspects of regulatory, certainly for clinical and safety and things like that. But when it comes to CMC, I think it's really important to have someone who is an expert and knows what the regulations are, and making sure very early that the team is aware of what needs to be done at what stage in development. At some point you're going to bring in your own in-house CMC regulatory people who have experience, because you're going to have more than one product. But I think for a young company, it's really important to make sure that you're going to have a head of regulatory, but you're going to need a consultant for CMC regulatory to make sure that the team is moving forward. Because obviously, the manufacturing group, I think of them as engineers. They know how to solve engineering problems, but they're not always aware of the regulations. So I think you have to make sure that the engineering process is matched up with the regulations, and the regulations are also different in different geographic regions. So what's required in Japan or in the EU or the US can be slightly different, and you better make sure that you have the information that you need for the regulatory region that you plan to release your drug.
So that's great feedback, Ed, and I get that. Clearly there's a bit about sort of knowing the information and knowing when to get that and knowing who to talk to. Is there also a piece about how that conversation is championed within a C-suite conversation? Because I can imagine, in sort of from my own experience of sort of typical C-suite conversations around all of the different pressures or priorities there may be, sometimes there's a need to be a little bit clearer around why certain CMC issues may matter and warrant conversations versus some of the other pressures that are there.
Yeah, and I think what I've done in the past is, I will bring in my head of CMC basically make it into the C-suite so that it's a topic of conversation as part of your leadership group. And so, typically you'll be focused, obviously on what's the commercial build out, what's the regulatory strategy, what's the enrollment in your clinical trial. And you have many aspects of the company, you have human resources, but I think someone who is in charge of manufacturing needs to have a senior role and a seat at the table so that you're reviewing manufacturing all the time. And I can say, I've been somewhat surprised, we thought we had and most companies are not going to do all of their own manufacturing. I would say using contract manufacturers, CDMOs, to do the work. But one of the things that's important is you really have to have your own team supervising what the contract manufacturers are doing. And that's probably the biggest mistake that I've seen is you're assuming that the contract manufacturer is doing the right thing. But manufacturing is so important that you have to have your own people. And what we've done when we've had problems, we've sent our team in and have them review every process in the drug manufacturing, both for the drug substrate, drug product, and recheck and make sure that the CDMO is doing what they say they're doing. And that's and CDMOs vary on the quality. And even you could be having the same CDMO, one side is fine, the other is not. And I think you can't assume that everything is going fine unless you go in and check it yourself. So I would say if one thing I've learned over the time, don't assume that everything's going well just because the CDMO says that is. Make sure that you're on top of it. And the same is true for CROs in clinical trial. I mean, we go through and we have our own people audit the CROs for clinical trials. And the same thing should happen with the CMCs. Somebody in-house got to be overseeing that manufacturing process because it's just so easy to make mistakes.
What this hearing is so much about championing that cause, but also, I guess, a theme that Deborah and I have heard in some of these other conversations we've had with colleagues is also about ensuring that the truth is shared, at that C-suite, saying it how it is, and then looking at how do you resolve that and how do you champion that through to success.
If I look back at Genzyme, the process that Genzyme got into was manufacturing really a crisis. And they got into that crisis because part of which was their own success. They were very successful. They had new drugs that were being put on the market, but they didn't expand their own manufacturing. And if I look back at it, I think what we heard is that there was a reluctance on the part of some of the senior management to spend the money, the capital expenditure on a new manufacturing facility. And I think there needed to be more of a very strong voice on the part of the CMC group in saying, we are going to run into a problem if we don't expand. We can't keep up this pace, because what was happening, and we realize in retrospect, is that the bioreactors were working 24/7. There wasn't time to basically shut off the reactors, to clean it, to check it, to make sure everything was functioning properly, because there was such a need to continue manufacturing to supply the world. And so that's a problem in senior management. You didn't allocate the capital expenditure, the money, to expand your manufacturing to keep up with the demand. And you assumed that you could do it with a less than adequate, manufacturing system. And so I think, manufacturing is so important that you have to make sure that, you do it correctly. And if you're not doing it yourself, the other problem is that you should have some redundancy. Don't assume that everything is going to go right. What happens if there's a 483 on one of your manufacturers and they have to close down and there's some problem? You better have an alternative, and that means you have two sources of manufacturing for everything, so that if something happens, you have the ability to switch. It's costly and it's money, but it's really expensive when things go south and you suddenly don't have drug, and there's nothing more expensive than that. And so the idea that we can't spend the money, my response is you can't afford to make a mistake.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly, when you get into the commercial aspect of, being ready for, preparedness for the market and everything. But, that's a hard ask for early biotech to build in those redundancies in manufacturing. And, the tech transfer, from the initial product manufactured at your, laboratory, or academic institution to the CDMO is, really is key. And I think you mentioned auditing and making sure that you had control over that process.
Right.
How do you the redundancy that you speak about here in terms of commercial, how do you ensure that you have, sort of plan for that or control for that when you're in the early stages, when you really don't have the funding to be able to, have that large scale built-in redundancy?
So, we did this at Stoke. Is we had some challenges with manufacturing, and we ended up having to change one of our sites for fill finish, and we were just unsatisfied with the process. And what we ended up doing is we did have two sources, one for drug substance and one for fill finish. We didn't do it all at once. We started the process once we were in phase 3, once we were able to raise more money based on the clinical data. And then what we had is the timing was that we would have two sources by the time we were ready for commercialization. So again, as you know better than I, it's a long process for tech transfer, and it is expensive. And so you have to start well ahead of when you want to actually start up the manufacturing at a new site. So what we did, it was just more of a graded startup that we tried to figure out when we were ready for commercial, that we had two manufacturing sites and had redundancy. So it was I think it was really a matter of timing.
It's clear, Ed, as a CEO, that there's lots of sort of pressures and pulls on your time with all of the different aspects associated with running a company, a portfolio, a product. But what it strikes me is, to you, CMC really matters, and you've always got an ear to understand, and what you expect and want is someone to champion the CMC agenda, to say it how it is, to speak truth, be comfortable managing risk. But I guess bottom line it's about making sure that you have a plan.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. And I think also, one of the things that, obviously a CEO cannot be expert in every area. We all bring our areas of expertise. Mine was in medical, and so obviously I understood clinical development and I understand that aspect. But obviously I was not an expert in finance. I was not an expert in CMC. I think what you have to do is to bring in people. And one of the things I've learned over time is you really need to bring in people who have some experience. It's great to have young people and allow them to learn, but you also need to balance that with people who have experience. The other thing too is you need to have people who are willing to challenge, because it's easy, it's easy for a CEO to say, "Oh, it's too expensive, we can't do it." But if person in charge of the CMC, feels very strongly that it is necessary, they have to be able to voice that opinion, at a senior meeting, and so that the funding can be obtained to make sure you're doing things correctly. So it really is, you have to be honest and sometimes a little brave. It's not always, it's not always comfortable. And I've been in that position before I was a CEO, when you're kind of getting yelled at by the CEO. And what I realized is that if you're strong enough in your opinion, the CEO is going to listen. And I remember being called back to the CEO's office, and he said, "Why are you so stubborn on this?" And I said, "This is why." And then he said, "All right, I guess I didn't understand." So I think it's really important that you have to be the champion for your own area of expertise, and make sure that people understand that this is a real threat and a liability if you get this wrong. And so it's easy to just cave in because you don't like being yelled at, but sometimes you actually have to stand up and say, this is what I believe very strongly is the right thing that has to be done.
So it's clear there's a common theme that we're hearing through conversations with you, Ed, and with others, is that you want to be challenged. If there's a point that needs to be heard, albeit said appropriately, but you want to be challenged. You want to hear the truth. You want to understand what the situation is so that you can look to resolve it.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I learned over the years in kind of dealing with the C-suite is I try to be the last person in the room to speak. And the reason for that is what I found is sometimes if I give my opinion too early, then I have a tendency to persuade people. And sometimes it's rare that I don't have an opinion when I come into a meeting, with the senior executives. But sometimes my opinion can change based on the information that I received during that meeting. And so if I speak too early, I think what I appreciate that I lose an opportunity to learn something, and to be able to change my mind and to be able to perhaps make a better decision. And that means also bringing in senior leaders who you really trust their opinion and you value their opinion, but then you have to listen to them.
Yeah. So I think you've actually sort of covered on a lot of the things I think you might say in my next question in terms of like really good advice. But, in terms of, a final, point over the bow, what advice would you give CEOs and C-suite leaders, who are at early stage companies about the importance of integrating a strategic CMC thinking, alongside of managing all the other priorities that you would have to manage?
Yeah, I would say one of the things that, we always have to keep in mind is that in, biotech and pharma, what we're trying to do is produce medicines that are needed for patients. And if we keep that in mind, we need to make sure that, we're developing a product that is going to be safe and that we understand the safety. We also want to make sure that we have a product that is very specific and pure. It's going to work all the time. And also ensure that we can continue to make it. So if you keep in mind that you don't want to, at the end of the day, you don't want to disappoint the patients. You don't want to give a drug that doesn't work. You don't want to give a drug that has side effects that you can avoid. And you want to make sure that once you've committed to providing drug to these patients, you can continue to do it. So if you keep that in mind, that your obligation is to make sure you're serving the patients that you're trying to develop the drug for, that keeps your priorities correct, I think.
So, Ed, thanks so much for you joining us on this podcast. We really enjoyed, hearing your experiences, some real practical advice for, these CEOs and CMOs who are developing these very important drugs to get them to patients. And I think, as you said, if that's your guiding light, then, and you focus on that, that'll help you reduce the risk and chart your path. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences.
Well, you're very welcome. It's an important topic, and I've enjoyed talking to you both.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ed. And as you say, CMC is an important topic, but I sometimes wonder whether it gets sort of a little bit ranked lower, opposite sort of safety and efficacy. But there's three prongs to the stool. And this is just as important. And I think you, through this conversation, have really emphasized the importance that CMC really matters and you need a strategy. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, and I think that what for CEOs to remember is that it's much easier to learn, to avoid mistakes rather than learning from your mistakes, because it's very, very costly. So just don't forget that if you're worried about money, the most expensive thing that you can do is to screw up your CMC manufacturing process. It's very costly.
Yeah.
Message heard.
Loud and clear.
Debra, I thought that was a really interesting conversation with Ed, and this is our fourth podcast, but I would say as topics go, is probably one of the most important topics. And probably one of those that gets perhaps more underlooked or overshadowed by sort of safety and efficacy and investors. But I think what Ed clearly spoke to is that CMC really matters. And he's really looking to, a regulatory leader to champion that, and to speak the truth, champion the truth, and equally challenge him as a CEO. And I think that really sort of spoke to the sort of phenotype of a leader that's needed to champion the CMC to get it right. And I think, as Ed said, in getting it wrong, it's very costly, And so I think that was, I think this has been a really interesting conversation, which has spoken to the topic, but also the type of leader that's needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what I got from that is that him as the CEO, as the leader of the whole company, the one who's like pulling everyone together, how important it is, again, to have that regulatory voice to be able to help him pull that story together and pull that thread together and to avoid mistakes rather than having to react to mistakes. Or not so much mistakes, but sort of roadblocks or problems. So just be able to anticipate that and to be able to, move forward in, a phase-appropriate manner as quickly as you can to get this to patients, because, the manufacturing of this should not be the thing that is preventing you from getting you to patients. I think I'm really excited about what our next episode is going to be, and I think that it will really wrap up and bring together a lot of the topics that we've already covered.
Yeah, I think all of the podcasts we've done today have provided the foundation for the next podcast we're going to do, which is how do we bring it all together in the context of late-stage development and ensuring that we get products to patients. Stay tuned.